Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. This is Juan, Cornelius Seed Innovation Lead, and this morning I'm joined by Craig Allaman. In this podcast, we're going to cover lots of great topics, from an update on this season's drought stress on the crops, uneven tasseling and corn and fungicide timing, silk clipping, wildfire smoke effects, and much more. So let's get started. Good morning, Craig.
Good morning.
How you getting any rain this morning?
We got some overnight. I noticed it was wet out there. Didn't look like a whole lot, but looks like things are still headed this direction from the west.
Well, I think you've always said when it comes to grain fill time and whatnot that rain is our friend. So, but I guess before we jump into the timing of the rain, what if I know you've been kind of all over Wisconsin and everywhere in Iowa, I guess east of 35 and your home state there in Illinois. What have you been seeing? Because my drive between between Scott County here in the Quad Cities up 61 towards Jackson County, Iowa, where the office is at, crops look really good there, but it starts getting spotty when we get into Jackson County. What are you seeing as you're kind of going all over Cornelius country?
Well, the crops in relation to the kind of the severity of this early summer drought that we had have held up fairly well. Now that depends on where you're sitting. There's some areas that were definitely more severe than others, but we have, over the last week or so here, we've had, some alleviation to that drought stress. Several storms. We just kind of have continued to get some moisture and some storms, but they have been, somewhat spotty. So I know as I say that, there'll be people that are saying, we really haven't seen that here, not very much. And that's definitely true. And that's always the tough part of farming. Some people get relief and others don't. So we've got varying degrees of that, but certainly we're better as a whole across the Corn Belt than we were, a week, 10 days ago. Some areas have gotten quite a bit, maybe to the point where we've started to increase the subsoil moisture back a little bit, but other areas probably just enough to kind of keep getting, going along, chugging along, and important time for that because we're heading into that R1 stage when we're going to be silking. We're seeing tassel shoot and silks are coming out, and then we're going to have our pollination period, which of course is one of the key periods of yield in corn. And then soybeans, we're well into the R2 stage where we're putting flowers on up and down the plant that are turning into pods. And that also is important to not have stress during that time period so we don't abort flowers and abort pods. So, I think cautiously optimistic. We talked at our meeting up at in Wisconsin there a week ago.
La Crosse, Wisconsin. Yep.
Yeah, we were up at La Crosse. We talked about the fact that we're going to live with this drought for a while because it's, our soils are depleted enough that one rain's not going to, take care of the rest of the year. So we're going to have to continue to get rains in a lot of the areas. But I'm cautiously optimistic right now anyway.
Well, and I take it with a grain of salt when the USDA puts out their update, because that crop progress and condition report, it's a volunteer program too, so everybody reports a little different from the area, but it seemed on the last one I saw, they saw that corn silking reached 22%, which was 6 days ahead of last year and 2 days ahead of the 5-year average. So we're ahead on silking, and then so the corn conditions held steady at 61%, which of what they called good to excellent. So soybeans, nearly half of the crop was blooming, and I know you were blooming way ahead of the summer solstice. So my brother-in-law down in southern Illinois, they were too. So it'll be an interesting year. I don't think I've ever heard so much flowering so early on. So it'll be kind of neat to see how that story continues to unfold with the uptake in bushels.
Yeah, for sure. And then, we're heading into grain fill now. So that's the biggest really time that we put weight in those kernels and weight in those seeds and add yield to the plant. So we got a ways to go but we have a good base on some of these early planted crops, especially to build on.
So kind of segueing into that and a little bit of what my brother-in-law talked about. They came up for a visit this Sunday, and they're south of Springfield, Illinois. Like I said, I'm in the Quad Cities, and so he mentioned kind of exactly what Cliff was talking about, our regional sales manager. He said that some spots would look good, and then some spots were tasseling, and it was really uneven, which is obviously attributed to your emergence and how everything came out of the ground. How are folks? What's the best way to gauge your fungicide application? I mean, I know we had a plan.
Yeah, that's a good point in general, and it's kind of a reflection of this early season drought that we've had. We talk about how everything has been magnified by this early season drought. So it really uncovers problems that we have out in the field. The warts come to the surface and show up. And we do have a lot of unevenness, and that probably as you drive through here and cross the corn belt and look at how evenly things start to tassel, you can pick out the areas that have had a worse drought than others. We would like to tassel, the whole field within a or so or two of when we start, but there's streaks I'm seeing in the fields and just intermittent tasseling. So it's going to be, that from the beginning to the full tassel is probably going to take over a week. It looks like with this year's crop, and there's just a lot of microclimates out there, because of the severity of the drought we had in the top few inches. We talked again at our meeting last week about the winds we had in the spring and just how dry it was when we planted. That top couple inches, we were chasing moisture in subsoil, and we clearly did to get to the point we're at now with the crop we have. But that surface was really dry, and roots won't dry in hot, dry soil. So we had trouble, even when we got to the nodal root time frame of getting some of those roots established out to that nice wide surface that we'd like to have. And we saw, as a result, we've seen nutrient deficiencies. I've never seen potash deficiencies so pronounced, and potash deficiency shows up on the leaf margins. So the leaf edges of the corn or the soybeans, we see it along field edges, where we let less actual potash, potassium. And normally that's maybe a row or two, and seeing 4 to 6 rows in a lot of places this year. So everything just really on the ragged edge because of that early season drought. And so we have a lot of unevenness in the crop. We might be a leaf stage or two behind, from one plant to the next. And I think most of that goes back to not really emergence. I think the emergence was pretty even, unless some of the plants were in dry soil and others weren't. But I think just those microclimates throughout the field, our growth stages have been very uneven. So back to your original question, we're here in pollination, and how does that affect us? Is there something that we need to watch out for? So this R1 stage, when silking occurs, that is the ultimate stage to spray a fungicide on corn. It's just proven, time after time, that gets you the most yield the most profit by spraying at that point in time. But do I have a concern if I've got, some of my tassels are out and others aren't, or should I wait, or what's the best thing to do? So we used to worry, a decade or two ago when foliar fungicide in corn really got popular. Guys were spraying it with their post sprayers kind of as late as they could. So sometime after V12, let's say, they were getting over with their sprayer, but they didn't have enough clearance to wait until it was fully tasseled. And they were putting on, 10, 15 gallons of water, fungicide with an adjuvant. And that's when we got into that beer can ear syndrome. So, or arrested development. We were making those ears. That's when the plant was determining the length of those rows, we were injuring it, and we were making those ears short. So we always remember that. It's a concern when we have plants that aren't tasseled, should we be spraying? But that those plants are far enough along. I think if you get 50% of that field tasseled, you're fine to go ahead and pull that trigger and get that fungicide applied. I think that's just a different thing than it was years ago when we were going significantly earlier and we were putting large gallons of water on with a post sprayer, and it was the adjuvant that they really kind of triggered or figured out that was causing a problem, just getting too much into the plant too quickly. So I think, as a general rule of thumb, you wait till you get 50% of that field pollinated, you can go ahead and pull that trigger. But if you've had rain and you're not real stressy at the time, because stress relief is a part of what, the bang for our buck we're getting with fungicides, you can wait till that field's fully tasseled, and you might get another few days or a week of residual by doing that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I know one of the questions that had come in before we did this, and as a side note, I invite anyone listening that you have a topic around, a question around anything that we talk about that you'd like for us to talk about, don't hesitate to send it to us. We'd be happy to cover it. But at any rate, do fungicides affect pollination? Someone was wondering about that.
No, the fungicides won't affect pollination. There's no negative impact on the pollen or the silk or anything. So, the safety from that aspect is very good. So there's really no timing concerns or anything on that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we covered that pretty good, and kind of related to right around that same stage of the crop development and silk's out. Let's talk a little bit about silk clipping. What effect can that have on our crop, our yield, and what should we be scouting for? I think we always mention scouting every time of the year, and I'm sure there's a good campaign attached to this. But let's move on to silk clipping.
Yeah. So the main two culprits that we're looking for silk clipping are rootworm beetles. Mostly in continuous corn is obviously what we're worried about there, unless it's coming in off a neighbor. But we do kind of at the same time worry a little bit about Japanese beetles, although through the years, now I'm going to say this with a caveat because you always need to get out there and make sure you're checking and err on the side of being cautious with it. But Japanese beetles generally move in and start clipping silks or feeding on the silks a little bit late. Anytime I've found them, if you pull an ear off and carefully remove the husks so that you're not ripping silks off there, and then you gently shake those, those silks, the silks that have pollinated will come they'll attach, from the kernel that's pollinated. So it's a good way to check and see how many kernels are pollinated. And the silks come from the butt of the ear first. So you're going to pollinate the butt and work your way up to the tip. So a lot of times when you do that, when it's at the very end and that ear is mostly pollinated, you might just have a few silks left on the tip of the ear that remain attached. But so back to the Japanese beetle, anytime I've seen clipping from the Japanese beetles all do that, and that ear just most times, 9 times out of 10, will be fully pollinated already. So it's like they don't like the newer silk. They like the silk that's a little bit older. But rootworm beetles, on the other hand, they're wanting to feed on pollen and silk. Now, if they come out early before there's pollen and silks, if they come out of the ground, because they're obviously feeding on the roots in the larva stage, and then they'll pupate in the soil and come out as adults. And you might see some scarring on the leaves where they've fed on the leaves, just keeping themselves alive until that pollen and that silk come along, and then that's what they're going to feed on the rest of the year. So they will clip those silks back. And I was out looking at a field just east of Cedar Rapids last week, and there's actually a pretty droughty area. Concerned whether we were shooting ears or not, because the customer had noticed that the tassels were out and there was no ear shoots in sight at all. So by the time I got to the field, it had been 2 to 3 days, and when we got there, the ears were coming out. A little bit of a off timing, we would have expected them already to be out, but this drought does some weird things, and sometimes timing on the ears and the tassels are off a little bit. Now, we'll drop pollen in corn plant for a couple of weeks normally. Under drought stress, that may be reduced down to even a week. So, but he would have had plenty of time when those ears got out to go ahead and get pollinated. But tons of rootworm adults clipping silk. So, he called in an airplane and got them sprayed that day, because they'll clip those silks back and far enough. I mean, they'll eat them right down to the tip of the ear, and there's no way to get pollinated at that point. So those are the two that we look for. And if you're in a continuous corn situation, you need to look every year. And you probably know if you're in a Japanese beetle situation, because they're eating a shrub by your house or a fruit tree or something like that. If you have heavy pressure, you'll know they're in the area, and you do need to check. The other thing about Jap beetles is a lot of times they only be in the outside half dozen, 10 rows, something like that. If you go out into the field, they don't seem to get out into the field as much as they do along the edges.
Oh, that'd be interesting when you're on the combine to see what's happening out there. I think as you were talking about that, I was just kind of looking things up, and I see that at one point in time, the University of Wisconsin felt like that if there's about at least 5 to 6 rootworm beetles per plant, that's enough to lead to some economic loss. So,
yep, absolutely.
Go out there, scout, protect your profits. That's one important thing to note. The second thing is more of a public service announcement. And you mentioned being out by Cedar Rapids or Cedar Falls looking at a field. To anyone that's listening, whether you're a customer or not, it is known that with the promise of a good tenderloin, you can lure Craig out there. He'll take a look at whatever you need him to. So just putting that out there, broadcasting it to the world.
That is, I can confirm that is a fact.
Wonderful. Do you have anything else to well, actually, no, I do have a question. This came up in La Crosse at our meeting whenever we had a plant pathologist there talking about some of these topics, and it was, what happens? What's the best time to work on these applications if you cannot get a plane lined up? Because it seems like when we all need them, they're all busy and there's not enough out there. And I know fortunately there's a lot of drone spraying going on to help soften up that impact. But what are your thoughts on that, on lining someone up and having issues with it?
Well, there's people out there. You can, you get a high boy sprayer like a Hagee, a high clearance sprayer, maybe even some of the newer John Deere's or airplane. But what you need to do is have somebody in mind, somebody lined up just in case. So that's no different than, planning anything else we do ahead of time. You just need to know where you can go to in case of emergency.
Proper
So,
preparation. That makes sense. I just the other, moving on from silk clipping, and that's wildfire smoke effects. I think right now we're kind of in a lull. At least I know in my area we haven't seen it. There was some days that it was just really thick. Um, I wondered, it's how does that affect photosynthesis? And what have you seen? Is there any research that you've come across? And what are your thoughts on all of this consistent, sustained Canadian wildfire smoke and its effect on corn and soybean crops?
yeah, well, there's a couple of schools of thoughts on it, and not the first time we've had wildfire smoke to deal with. So there's some history that we can probably point to, but I get Sean Conley from University of Wisconsin. His Cool Bean blog comes on across email, and he had an article on this sometime within the last week. I was just reading, and what he was talking about is we're going to have obviously a reduction in the amount of just straight sunlight, just straight raw direct solar radiation. That has to be expected, but there is something called diffuse radiation. It's DIFFUSE, just like it sounds, diffuse radiation or diffuse sunlight. And basically, that smoke is bending the light, like a prism would or something. And so with direct sunlight, you're going to have shading of that canopy, so there's a lot of that lower canopy that's not going to get any sunlight on the leaves because the upper canopy is shading it, just like it, we want to shade weeds out. But with this diffuse radiation, where it's bending that light's actually going to be shooting from a bunch of different directions, and it's going to get down there and start hitting some of that lower canopy that normally is blocked. So, the question would be, have I got more damage from losing direct solar radiation, or got with the diffuse radiation, or even more? I mean, there's a possibility that, it could be actually a positive for the crop. So I would say good chance that it's a wash. If nothing, it might even have helped a little bit in some areas. So that's positive. It's a very interesting article. If you want to jump on the Cool Bean side, I'm sure you can pull it up and read the whole thing.
Well, I'll make sure to link it on the podcast notes. That way, anyone can get to it. And I know he had a lot of good research on the early planted soybeans. I think everybody and their mother had it, including probably anyone's own operation that's been trying it out. And also had some good stuff on if you're replanting soybeans, if how much the relative maturity matters, and so definitely a lot of good stuff out there. So
yep, Sean does great work. He's just has an inquiring mind, and he's just very down to earth approach to his research. It's real things that matter to real farmers. So
that's definitely true. Well, Craig, I think we've hit most of what we wanted to talk about. What's a key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap this up?
Well, I think key takeaway is, we talk a lot about fungicides in both corn and soybeans. And, I know in times like this, if you're in a really stressy area, you question, should I put more money into my crop? But a lot of times under these situations, that may be the best money you spend all year. We've talked about the stress relieving properties of fungicides. We want to make sure we have a strobilurin fungicide in that package. Most of these products are combo products, and most all of them have strobies in them. And that's important because strobies are stress relievers. They suppress the production of ethylene gas, which is what the plant produces when it's under stress, and it's kind of a signal to start shutting things down. So by suppressing that, inhibiting that production, that it's a very it's a very good stress reliever. And if you're in an area that has just barely been getting some moisture or not at all, even, that's probably pretty good thing to do. Plus the fact that we're getting into conditions that we talk about, the disease triangle, we're getting into those, that environment that's going to be really conducive to getting some of these foliar fungal diseases rolling. A lot of the tar spotter, spore caster, those kind of things, those modeling type programs are showing that we probably got a pretty good chance with tar this year. Heard possibly some southern rust moving up, which is, those two are a really bad combination together. And then as I go outside and do literally anything and start sweating now, that tells me that it's gray leaf spot time of the year. So I think foliar fungicides are going to be a great investment again this year.
Craig, that I sweat when it's winter. That concerns me. Sounds like it's gray leaf spot every time of the year.
Very well.
No, but on a serious note, thank you for bringing up those two apps there. I know I talk about the plant pathologist that was at our meeting, and he's involved in helping get those created. And so I will link those also on the episode notes. I realize we didn't talk a lot about tar spot, but I mean that's been beat this last week or two, especially since it started to pop up. And you mentioned the disease triangle. It's obviously one huge element of that is the environment. And I saw a map recently where in that central part of Iowa where it was first getting reported, you can almost overlay that perfectly with like some recent storms that were there, right? So you were getting that humidity and that moisture that was conducing to those diseases, foliar diseases popping up. So keep an eye.
There's a couple other modeling programs or two, or companies that are working with it. They were predicting tar. It's kind of southeast Iowa, west central Illinois, even earlier than that. And I'm a little bit skeptical at their modeling, just because not skeptical in the sense that they can't do it, but you want to see it proven. So we'll watch that and kind of see how their system's working. If it turns out to be true that we start seeing some tar actually on the crop, and any major amounts, we'll know that they've probably got things figured out pretty good.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that. Those of you listening, thank you for joining and spending your time with us. Subscribe to the podcast. That way you can get notifications when we do post one. I know we're a little spotty at times, but we want to make sure we get on here when there's timely things to talk about. So thank you for taking your time, and check us out on social media. You'll find us on Twitter, and Facebook, and Instagram, and all those other places. So have a great rest of your week.